strategic tax planning in retirement. Well, here to talk with me about that is Amy Shepard from Sensible Money. Amy, welcome.
Hi, Bob. Thanks so much.
Pleasure to have you. I believe you're going to walk us through the process you use at Sensible Money to create a withdrawal plan, first with no tax strategies, and then create a second version that has been optimized for more potential tax efficiency with Roth conversions, QCDs, IRMAA planning, and the like.
That is exactly right.
Well, take it away then. All yours.
All right. So perfect. Well, what I have up here on the screen, Bob, is the Excel model we use at Sensible Money. And in our planning process, we walk clients through 3 different meetings. What you and I are going to go through today is what we cover in the second meeting of Sensible Money's planning process. So in the first meeting, we lay all the groundwork. We talk about assumptions. We figure out, when is income going to start and stop? How are expenses going to fluctuate throughout retirement? And so all of that foundational stuff has already been talked about. What we go through in the second meeting, as you alluded to, is how can we potentially increase the tax efficiency in the plan? And so that's what I am going to walk through. I'm going to start with one version of the plan, which we often refer to as the base version. So the base version is just, no proactive tax planning. We'll walk through that, and then we'll walk through a second version, which we refer to as the tax managed version, which is an attempt to, potentially increase tax efficiency over somebody's lifetime. So feel free to jump in if you have questions as we walk through it. But basically, very high level. This is an abbreviated version. In an actual planning meeting with a client, usually we spend about 90 minutes. My goal for us today is maybe 15 minutes or so. So first thing is just how we lay out a plan. So every retirement plan starts with kind of a basic calculation of income minus expenses equals portfolio withdrawals. And so in this case, this is a single client who is working. She makes a very good income. She'll be retiring at the end of the year. So you see her income stops, it's 2026, no income. Eventually, she has pension and Social Security start, but she is a pretty young retiree. So those things don't happen until much farther out in the plan, but they're there. That's the income section. The expense section is exactly what it sounds like, expenses and taxes. At a high level, this is somebody, if we add up all of their spending the first year in retirement, she's spending about $100,000 a year, not including taxes. I will point out, this is someone who is a very high income earner with very modest spending. So she's accumulated a pretty healthy portfolio and, not planning to take very substantial withdrawals. So if we just combine income and expenses, that gets us to the section C, which is either savings or withdrawal. So this year she's working. She has $440,000 of income, roughly $260,000 of expenses. The bulk of that is taxes, high income earner, single tax filer. The difference is saying, her income is greater than her expenses. She can save money this year. Well, next year she retires. And she has to take about, 100,000 or so. It increases every year, but those are her portfolio withdrawals. So very high level here, but that's her plan. When we develop a tax strategy, the first thing we try to show a client is, well, what does your tax situation look like if you kind of don't do anything? You follow this conventional wisdom where you defer your tax deferred accounts as long as possible, kick that tax can down the road, you spend from other places first. And so that's what this is. It's starting off with withdrawals next year, like I said, a little over $100,000 a year. So if we go down to the withdrawal section, that's what this is showing. She has, 4 buckets of money. Traditional retirement accounts, those are all IRA, 401k assets. Roth retirement accounts, exactly what they sound like. Non-retirement accounts is a combination of, brokerage, high yield savings accounts, CDs, things like that. And then she has an HSA. Let me pause for a minute before I start walking through the withdrawal piece, and just, does that all make sense so far, Bob, or any questions
it makes
on your
sense.
end?
And I think this gets to the point, if people were doing a back of the napkin calculation around how much they could withdraw from their retirement accounts or their accounts earmarked for retirement, the $100,000 would equate to roughly, what would that be? 40, 80, $2.5 million perhaps, right? If you were using the 4% rule.
Yep. Yep, that's about right. And this client has twice that much. And so we will touch on that in a minute, but this is a rough estimate here. These light gray numbers show how much money at the beginning, at the end of the year, we expect her to have in each of these, 4 different buckets. Total portfolio value estimated a little over $5 million at the end
Yeah.
of the year.
So in the world of retirement management advisors, the term of art would be that she is overfunded, right?
Very overfunded, yes, which is why you see her retirement happening at the end of this year, because one of the things we talked about in the first meeting was, the fact that she has already saved so much. Does she want to keep working? And her answer was no, she doesn't. And she saw the math that says, wow, I really don't have to. So we covered that first. But yeah, she is very overfunded and has a lot of options. So the first thing I would walk through here is just if she doesn't do any proactive tax planning, kind of that conventional wisdom out there just says, well, spend from your non-retirement bucket. There's a lot of nuances here, but one of which is her age. If she retires before 59 and a half, there's age considerations. All of that's we've thought through it all here. But in this version of the plan, no tax planning, she would just spend from her non-retirement bucket, high yield savings, like I said, continue to kick that tax can down the road. So what you see in this is that every year she just takes the withdrawals she needs from her brokerage account. Eventually what happens is she spends that brokerage account down to zero. And now she has to start taking money from somewhere else. So she starts tapping into that traditional IRA bucket. And again, she's just taking out enough every year to cover her $100,000 a year in spending plus taxes. And that's it. She just goes along that way. Well, eventually what happens is she turns 75 and she has to start taking RMDs. Well, because she just kicked that tax can down the road, those RMDs are pretty significant. One of the assumptions in the plan is that her portfolio averages about 5% a year. It's a pretty conservative, assumption for somebody who retires in their mid 50s and potentially lives till 90. But part of retirement planning is we do make conservative assumptions in a lot of places. In this example, she would get to 75 and potentially have an RMD of about $250,000. Well, we talked about already, she's not a big spender. And so she is forced to take that 250 out, pay ordinary income tax. She doesn't need to spend it all. So what happens is the extra that doesn't get spent just gets deposited back into her brokerage account. And then if you just continue on throughout her retirement, you see really big RMDs. The extra isn't needed. It just goes into her investment account and her portfolio just grows and grows and grows. And eventually, out here, potentially at age 90, she's looking at RMDs over $400,000. So that's the withdrawal strategy, which is not much of a strategy, but that's a path somebody could follow. Any questions so far,
Yeah.
Bob?
So if you go back to the non-retirement account with withdrawals, Amy, before the RMDs kick in, I suspect that that's a mix of interest income, dividend income, and perhaps capital gains.
So great question. What we do at Sensible Money is we have a third meeting where we talk about how to align these withdrawals to the investments to these withdrawals. In a perfect world, it would be, maturing bonds every year that would cover bonds or CDs would cover these withdrawals. So it would be the maturities plus the interest, and then yes, dividends and other cash flow that's generated in the portfolio.
All right. Next step.
So next step is if this was the path she followed, what does it look like from a tax perspective? And so that is what we can show down here. So again, very high level here, but if this was the path she followed, she'd be in a high tax bracket while she works this year. Then next year she retires. She hasn't started Social Security yet. She hasn't started her pension. And you see in green, there are many, many years of her being in a 10 or 12% tax bracket. So she's just living on, cash savings, maturing bonds and CDs. In her case, she doesn't have a low basis in her brokerage account, so there's not a ton of capital gains considerations. But then what happens is out here, you see her tax rate bumps from 12 to 24%. Well, what happened there is if we go back up, her brokerage account ran out of money, and now she is starting to take those IRA withdrawals. So she's increasing her taxable income, and she's in 24% bracket for several years. Well, then what happens is technically RMDs start at age 75. And so, anybody following this might say, well, why does she get a big bump to the 32% bracket at 74? Well, that's because in her plan, we happen to have a vehicle purchase that year. And so she has a much bigger IRA withdrawal the year before RMDs to cover a vehicle purchase. But just continuing on the path, so now, RMDs start at 75. Now she's in a 32% bracket. And just as time goes on, RMDs get bigger. And later in life, she's in a 35% tax bracket. And so her tax story, what it looks like is, this potential for really low taxes early in retirement and higher taxes later in retirement, assuming current tax laws. So this factors in the big, beautiful bill that recently passed. Our approach to tax planning is we go based on what the laws say today. We have no idea what changes may happen in the future, but we know the tax rates today are expected to continue indefinitely. So we assume they increase with inflation and all of that, but no, thoughts that, taxes are definitely going to increase later or they're definitely going to be lower later. It's just, this is what they are today. So that's the tax picture. Another big part of this analysis for us is Medicare planning. So income tax is one thing, but Medicare, IRMAA, income related monthly adjustment amount, we think of that similar to a tax. It's essentially like if your income is higher, you pay higher Medicare premiums. So what that looks like for her is if we come down here, we have this section for all the different IRMAA Medicare brackets. Well, for IRMAA, Medicare only applies for those 65 or older, and your age 65 premiums are based on, your tax return when you're 63. So what you see for her, she's really young, under 63. So it doesn't matter. Her income these early years of retirement has no impact on Medicare. But eventually, what happens is I highlighted in red, you see the word over. Well, what this is saying is the year she turns 69, if we look back 2 years from when she was 67, the IRA withdrawals she took that year pushed her over 2 of the Medicare thresholds. Then she's only over a little bit for the next few years. But as time goes on, you see lots of red. You see the word over. And what that's just saying is by kicking the tax can down the road, by just delaying her IRA withdrawals, she's essentially, has the potential to be in a really high Medicare bracket for the bulk of, 70s and beyond. And so that can have a big impact on expenses later in life. Any questions on that, Bob?
No, but this is interesting because in the most recent Medicare trustees report, they're projecting Part B premiums to go up by over 10% in 2025, and that the rate of increase through 2033 will continue to be higher, much higher than the average rate of inflation. And so that's obviously a factor that you're considering is what is the percent increase in IRMAA charges as well.
Yeah, so that's a really great point. We are assuming a 5% annual rate. In her other sources of spending, every plan is different, but in this particular plan, we assume, basic living expenses are increasing at 3%, healthcare related expenses are increasing at 5%. So yes, we are assuming Medicare is going to increase higher than other things, but 5% is the number we use. So those are all the details. Some of the kind of like, okay, what does this mean in terms of like retirement metrics, or how can I analyze or evaluate this? Well, one of the things we look at in this particular meeting is something we call fundedness. You mentioned the 4% rule earlier, Bob, and your back of the napkin math was great. So what this is saying is that for this particular client to fund all of her future withdrawals, so back up here, all of these withdrawals in yellow, she would need about $2.6 million if her portfolio averaged, 4%. If she had $2.6 million, she would have 100% of what she needs, but she has more. She's got almost 5 million. And so she has, almost twice as much, 189% of what she needs, meaning she's overfunded. One of the things we look at with tax efficient planning is if we see this number and then we try to create a tax strategy, can we improve it? Can a strategic withdrawal plan help increase the level of lifetime fundedness? This is a net present value calculation. We're basically saying how much do you need today to fund all those future withdrawals? So that's one metric we'll compare in a minute, but any questions there?
No, but a question related to the top marginal tax rates that you showed a second ago, which I forgot to ask, which is many, and I'm sure many at your firms, look at the tax rates over the course of someone's retirement, so that you're looking at not necessarily what's the lowest tax rate next year, but what's the lowest tax rate on average over the course of 30 years.
Yes, for each particular plan, that's exactly right. That helps us decide, like in this case, potential future tax rates for this client are 35% at the high end. There's others where the potential highest, might only show us 24%. And so that does impact the strategy that we might, recommend from day one, depending what their particular pattern looks like. So that's one thing we look at. We also do a present value calculation on lifetime taxes and lifetime medical cost. And so that's what this table is showing. In this version with no tax strategies, potential present value of lifetime taxes is just over $1 million. And potential present value calculation for medical expenses. So that's Medicare premiums, IRMAA, out-of-pocket costs, that's around $650,000. So I have those written down. You don't have to remember them. We're going to compare them when we look at this next version to say, well, can we make this plan more efficient? And so that is what this is going to show you. The Section A, income, identical. Nothing changes. Social Security, pension, retirement date, all the same. Section B, spending is the same. So still about $100,000 a year in spending. What does change here is the tax numbers, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. But still same concept. So income minus expenses equals portfolio withdrawals. Well, what you'll see here is last time we were just over $100,000 a year in withdrawals. Now we're more like $150,000 a year. That increase is due to taxes. So we are going to proactively incur tax liability early on to take advantage of those green years in the tax trajectory. And so I will walk you through what that looks like. So here is the withdrawal section. But now, instead of just taking that $100,000 a year from her brokerage account, we built in Roth conversions, pretty large ones. So they go up a little bit every year because we assume tax brackets, increase in size a little bit each year. But basically, $175,000 to $200,000 a year in Roth conversions for about 8 years in this case. You do the Roth conversions, and then you take the withdrawals to cover both spending and taxes from the brokerage account. Well, what happens is, again, eventually that brokerage account is depleted, and then she has to take money from her IRA to fund her retirement. And the amount that we have coming out each year, starting at age 63, that's an important number because that's the first year that impacts Medicare premiums. So we're strategically trying to fill up the lowest Medicare bracket. We're taking out enough to cover expenses but not trigger IRMAA. And eventually what has to happen now is we get out here and you see there's withdrawals that begin from the Roth account. So at this point in her plan, she'd be taking some money from her traditional IRA, fill up that lowest Medicare bracket. She still needs more money to cover spending at this point. So the additional money will be withdrawn from her Roth account, and that's strategic to not trigger IRMAA. Well, also a tax strategy that we implemented here is qualified charitable distributions. So that is where you give money to charity directly from an IRA. You cannot do it until age 70 and a half. And so that's what happens here. She is, at the age she can do it, she starts giving money to charity from her IRA. It reduces her IRA balance. She doesn't have to pay tax on it. Then what happens is she gets to age 75, RMDs start. Well, after accounting for some money going to charity, she only has a remaining RMD of about 55,000. If you remember from our last version with no tax planning, her first RMD was 250,000. So that's a change here. So we've reduced that future RMD. We built in charitable giving because it's something she's open to. Not everybody is, and that's okay. But if you are, that's a strategy. We also have built in some HSA withdrawals. So HSAs are not a great asset to leave to somebody other than a spouse. This client doesn't have a spouse. And so there's, roughly what we try to do with HSA balances is if you're healthy, we would recommend investing them, let them grow. But then around RMD age, or if there's major health stuff to consider, eventually you want to start taking that money out because it's not a great inheritance to leave to somebody. So you see that factored in. It's a small balance in this plan. But overall, the tax managed strategy is, can we do some Roth conversions? Can we take advantage of charitable tax opportunities? And can we try to proactively make some decisions to reduce future RMDs? And then I'm sure your question, Bob, is, okay, great. Well, how does this all translate to taxes in Medicare, right? Any other questions from you, Bob, before we look at that?
Well, no, I guess that's the question. Is it on the surface? It's a bit tricky, right? Because you're filling up the top marginal rate, maybe to 22 or 24. At the same time, it's a different income metric for Medicare Part B premiums, which is modified adjusted gross income, right? So you've got these two sort of things that you have to balance.
Yep. I'll give you a quick look behind the scenes. So we do look at balancing those things. And what you see here is like when we're trying to figure out this amount, what amount, these are the marginal income tax brackets, and then these are the Medicare brackets. So just like you said, we're looking at both. In this case in particular, the main driver is the Medicare bracket. So we're trying to fill those up, but leave a little bit of buffer so we don't go over.
Yeah, I always say that retirement income planning is a row and column cell by cell exercise, and you're proving that.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Yep. So then if this was the plan, she followed, these Roth conversions happen and everything goes according to plan, which it never does, but this is an analysis based on today. What would this look like? How would it change her tax situation? So still the 35% bracket this year because she's working, but then all those green years go away because we filled them up. You were right on the money. 24% we fill up for it. It's not really filling up the 24% bracket. It's filling up the lowest Medicare. Well, in this case it is because she's not on Medicare yet. So filling up the 24% bracket, then reducing that and filling up most of the 22% bracket, but really trying not to trigger IRMAA. And then, you see just 22% tax bracket for the remainder of retirement.
No red.
No red. The other thing is IRMAA. So we come back down here and we look at Medicare. And I kept the red to show before everything in red said over, like she was paying higher Medicare premiums. In this version, there is no over. So essentially, if this is the way the math all works out, she would pay zero IRMAA during her retirement. You see it like she gets really close because every year we're trying to do enough QCD or to balance how much comes out of the IRA versus the Roth so that we can try to avoid IRMAA. I'm going to come back to the reality in a minute because this is math on paper based on today. But the big thing here is, how does it impact those metrics? Lifetime taxes, lifetime medical costs, fundedness. So if we go back to those things, in this version of the plan, her fundedness, it goes down from 189 to 187. Not a material amount, but I have had people say, well, wait a minute. I thought you told me that you try to increase that number by being tax efficient. In this case, it goes down slightly because we're doing QCDs. So the total amount of QCDs in this plan, it's almost $800,000. And that's $800,000 that is given away to charity, not kept within the portfolio. And so it does slightly reduce the fundedness, but the main takeaway here is it's still, showing she has almost twice as much money as she needs. She can give money away to charity, still be in great shape, but now she can save on taxes and save on Medicare costs. And that's what we showed on here. So this present value of taxes in this version is like 760,000. The last version was slightly over $1 million. So that's a roughly $300,000 difference. Medical expenses in the first version were around 650. In this version, they're under 500. So that's another, $150,000 of present value savings. So this is the very high level example of some of the things we look at. Before I talk about, some of the nuances, any comments or questions from you, Bob?
Well, just one major comment, Amy, when I think about people trying to explain the value of a financial advisor, here in black and white, we've demonstrated considerable tax savings that represents, I suppose, money in your pocket, not in Uncle Sam's pocket.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's a great thing that you pointed out too, because our strategy, and I think any financial planner who does, true comprehensive planning, we're not looking to save on tax dollars in any given year necessarily. We're looking at how can we increase tax savings over your lifetime. And sometimes that means you pay more tax early on for the potential to pay less tax later on. And none of this is ever just, so black and white that if you do the first version, you're going to have way more taxes. And if you do the second version, you're going to have way less. But it's a path to follow based on all the factors that we know to be true today. In real life, we always refer to our planning process as a point in time analysis. To really implement a plan like this, it needs to be constantly reevaluated. At least annually, you have to look at all these numbers again and decide, what is the number to fill up a certain income tax bracket or Medicare bracket? What about like life happening? Just because we built in these really big Roth conversions, that doesn't mean someone should just do them every year the way they're mapped out. A great example of that is like, one of my favorite things in Sensible Money too, one of our favorite things to help our clients with is to enjoy their money. Spend it while they can. When the numbers confidently show that there's enough money there, we try to help people enjoy using that money, early on in retirement. And so we may get to next year and talk about this plan and say, hey, Jane, we were planning to do $175,000 of Roth conversion, but you said you wanted to buy that RV, or you said you want to, get out of the winters and have a second home somewhere in the sunshine, or, help a niece or nephew with college or starting a business. Well, an easy adjustment is to say, well, we don't need to do this huge Roth conversion. What if we do half and the other half is a withdrawal that you use to spend? Again, have to say this client's 55. So there's more things we'd have to consider there. If we took some as a withdrawal, we'd have to take some from like an age 55 401k bucket, but that's a different conversation. The key is just, it's a framework, but it should be discussed every year and tweaked and adjusted based on not only the math, but most importantly on the client's goals. Like, what do they want their money to accomplish?
Yeah, it is good to know, like as you said, a point in time version of what could happen in the future. Retirement, from my perspective, it's not a set it and forget it exercise. Right? It is one that maybe has to be evaluated annually, as you said, or as life events happen, divorces, deaths, grandchildren, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And one easy way to illustrate that is like, this version might look so nice and clean that, wow, if I do all these things, I can avoid ever spending a dollar on IRMAA. Well, a really easy way to show that it doesn't always work out the way we planned is in this version, we assumed the portfolio averages 5% a year over the course of retirement. Well, just for fun, let's say the portfolio actually averages 6% over the course of the plan. That one small change, now we are over. There's a lot of IRMAA factored into the plan now. And so that's where we can adjust things. We can do maybe bigger qualified charitable distributions to help keep that, at zero. Or maybe it's fine, and maybe paying a little bit of IRMAA, the math still works and the client's still doing all the things they want to do, and it's no big deal. But the key is that the math never works out the way we map it out in the plan. It's just intended to give a starting point that then really needs to be monitored and adjusted.
Yeah. What are we missing? Any other nuances?
I think my only closing thought here was that, there is a lot of emphasis in this particular plan on Roth conversions, but Roth conversions don't always make sense. One of the things I thought of for us, Bob, is maybe our next video, we do something like this where we do the before and after of a plan where Roth conversions don't really do much. They don't save on Medicare. They don't really increase tax efficiency. That's my big, closing point that we haven't touched on is just because it looks good here doesn't mean it always looks good. And also in this plan too, like this client could decide, well, yeah, great, this looks awesome if I live till 90, but what if I get hit by a bus in 5 years and I just prepaid all this tax? Like in this case, there are family members that assets are going to go to. So all of that, there's just a lot that has to be considered. But I do want to emphasize Roth conversions aren't like the greatest thing that everybody should do. Sometimes they make sense and sometimes they don't.
Yeah. We'll dive deeper into that in the next video then.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for spending some time with me on this, Bob.